The Dragon Ball franchise exploded into popularity in the latter half of the 20th century, introducing many to the mediums of anime and manga. With a series as iconic as this one, it was not a long time after the anime's release, only 7 months to be exact, before games were developed within the popular universe. Relax and enjoy this Nimbus flight as we travel through the evolution of Dragon Ball video games. Dragon Ball, Dragon Daihikyo, or Dragon Ball, Dragon's Great Exploration, 1986. The very first gaming outing for the Dragon Ball series was released in 1986 for the Epoch Super Cassette Vision. Dragon Ball, Dragon Daihikyo, or Dragon Ball Dragon's Great Exploration, as it was called in the West, is the first and only game in the franchise not released by Bandai Namco. The anime was released just a few months before the first attempt at a game adaptation. The title is an early but promising look at Dragon Ball in the video game format. Players control Goku as he rides his flying Nimbus in a top-down shooter. Goku can either fire ki blasts at enemies or melee attack them with his polearm. The game sported beautiful, brightly colored pixel graphics and holds up decently well even almost 40 years later. Dragon Ball, Shenlong no Nazo, 1986. That same year, Bandai released their first of countless DBZ titles with Dragon Ball Shenlong no Nazo. The game's Japanese release loosely adapted the first volumes of the respective manga. Players were again tasked with controlling Goku in a top-down beat-em-up. The game even featured a transition to a side-scroller for special sequences like boss battles. Goku's main combat mechanic lacked the ki and polearm of the previous title, with the Saiyan just mainly punching his foes. However, players could increase Goku's ability with power-ups like Girl's Undergarments item, which increased his run speed. However, the US release of the title changed up the Dragon Ball theme in exchange for a loose adaptation of the Chinese 16th century novel, Journey to the West. The game was essentially reskinned for US audiences, as Goku was now just a stereotypical kung fu fighter, and the game's title was changed to Dragon Power, with no mention of Dragon Ball in the entire game. Also, the US and European versions did away with the more inappropriate aspects, like the aforementioned speed boost item swapped out for a triangle cut sandwich. Dragon Ball Z, Super Butōden, 1993. With a few more games adapting narratives from the series, Bandai looked to evolve the Dragon Ball gaming landscape. Enter Dragon Ball Z, Super Butōden, released in 1993 for the Super Famicom. This title brought Dragon Ball into a whole new genre, and one that fans of the franchise today will likely recognize: fighting games. Street Fighter was taking the world by storm, and Toshihiro Suzuki, who was in charge of producing the next DBZ game, wanted to make a similar experience in the Dragon Ball universe. This game featured 13 playable characters including Goku, Piccolo, and Vegeta. The gameplay was very similar to the Street Fighter titles at the time, with one-on-one battles across 3 modes of play and a 6-button control scheme. The success of a Super Butōden ensured that the fighting game genre was a perfect fit for the hit anime series, spawning multiple sequels and laying the groundwork for popular titles in the future. Dragon Ball Z, Idainaru Dragon Ball Densetsu, 1996. After several more fighting games in the Super Butōden style, with the audiences growing tired of the lack of changes between releases, the devs at Toast looked to innovate on their formula. In 1996, Dragon Ball Z, Idainaru Dragon Ball Densetsu was released for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. With a host of 2D fighters both in the Dragon Ball gaming catalog and in a wider fighting game genre, this title was made to stand out. It moved players into a 3-dimensional space with a focus on aerial combat. Players had the option of 35 playable characters, and up to 3 were chosen for each side of the exchangeable battle system. Each player had to balance their attacks or face exhaustion from depleting their ki meter. Once the life meter is completely gone, the winner enacts a special Meteor attack and finishes off their opponent. While the game moved into a 3D plane, it was not yet fully rendered 3-dimensionally, as the characters were still 2D sprites. However, it would not take long for gaming tech to allow for the next huge step in the Dragon Ball gaming catalog. Dragonball GT Final Bout 1997.
見せてやろう。この私の恐ろしい真のパワー。
One year later, and the devs at TOS were ready to fully embrace 3D. Dragonball GT Final Bout, released in 1997 for the PlayStation, was the first game to go full 3D. Okay, not full 3D. In typical fighting game fashion, players still duked it out on a two-dimensional plane, but the characters and setting were rendered in 3D. Final Bout introduced special key attacks called Special Knockout Trick, which were range attacks that saw the camera zoom in on the attacker as they powered up to fire a devastating blow. With another successful fighter game on the market, it was time to enter the next century and the next evolution for Dragon Ball video games. Dragonball Z Budokai 2002. After several games released from 1986 to 1997, the Dragon Ball gaming audience experienced a drought of content. 5 years passed with no new games, until a brand new Dragon Ball Fighter series emerged with Dragon Ball Z Budokai for the PS2, and then a year later on the GameCube. While previous fighters include story modes, this game had 3D cutscenes depicting the first 3 story arcs of Dragon Ball Z. There were even what-if story arcs for Vegeta, Frieza, and Cell. The cutscenes included voiceover from the popular anime series airing at the time. This game spawned multiple sequels and spin-offs in the form of the Tenkaichi series, all of which ensured fans of Dragon Ball had many games to play well into the 2010s. Dragonball Online 2010. The next experiment for Bandai Namco was Dragonball Online, an MMO adaptation of the series released in 2010. The story took place in the far future after Goku's departure and featured original characters created just for this experience. Players explored an open environment, spoke to NPCs and fellow players, and leveled up their created character from one of the 3 starter classes. Unfortunately, the servers only lasted about 3 years, but the endeavor into MMOs would lead to a more successful game we'll be discussing very soon. Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2015.
Dragonball Games. The legendary warriors as you've never seen them before.
5 years later, Bandai Namco returned to the MMO groundwork laid out by DB Online. Dragon Ball Xenoverse, released at the turn of a gaming generation for PlayStation 3 and 4, Xboxes 360 and 1, as well as Windows PC. The game took players into multiple open environments where combat occurred on ground, in the air, or even underwater. The player-created character takes on the role of apprentice to one of the previous Dragon Ball characters in order to acquire special abilities and gear related to said character. Players could meet up with friends in the hub world, Toki Toki City, before venturing off on co-op missions that took players back in time to different settings in the Dragon Ball universe. This game was a big success for Bandai Namco, and a sequel released just a year later with its own servers lasting 6 years.
Dragon Ball Xenoverse.
Dragon Ball Fighters 2018. The most recent installment in the storied fighting game catalog, Dragon Ball Fighters dropped in 2018 for PS4, Xbox One, and Windows with a Nintendo Switch version following 9 months later. The 2.5D fighting game borrowed heavily from the Marvel vs. Capcom series, where players form a team of 3 characters and battle it out in settings based on the Dragon Ball Super manga series. The roster featured 21 playable characters, along with paid DLC, adding an additional 24 others. Building on the numerous fighting games that came before, Dragon Ball Fighters saw widespread critical acclaim and snatched up multiple awards from various outlets, including Best Fighting Game at the 2018 Game Awards. It's really only a matter of time before another Dragon Ball fighting game is announced, but Fighters will definitely hold players over until then. Dragon Ball Kakarot 2020.
Either way, you're all dead! What are you looking at, punk? I'm gonna pound you into a pulp!
Finally, a AAA modern open-world action RPG set in the Dragon Ball universe outside of the MMO framework. It only took several decades of fighting games for Bandai to see the potential in exploring this massively popular gaming genre. While its combat loosely draws from the series' fighting game systems, this title introduced open-world activities like fishing and driving a hover car. There are 7 playable characters including series staple Goku, along with Vegeta, Gohan, Piccolo, Future Trunks, Gotenks, and Vegito. The story draws from the anime series as players move through 4 different sagas, completing quests and fighting bosses like Raditz, Nappa, and Dodoria to name a few. This game was another big success in the long line of Dragon Ball games, serving as January's #1 best-selling game within the US. The only other games to top it in all-time sales are Fighters and Budokai. With its success, it's safe to say that fans of the RPG format can look forward to another possible Dragon Ball game in the genre. Well, that's a look at the evolution of Dragon Ball games. I'm sure there's a few titles that we skipped over, so feel free to shout out your favorite key firing, Nimbus riding experience down in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a fantastic day!